Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. We so appreciate the partnership with the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for this series of History Revealed Making Minnesota. And we're excited to have John Andreazzi with us tonight, and Peter will talk a little bit more about him in a few minutes. I'm Robin with the Ramsey County Historical Society, and again, thank you all for being here. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And you can find out more about the Ramsey County Historical Society on our website, which is www.rchs.com. And please check out the Eastside Freedom Library's website, as well as the Ramsey County Roseville Library's website for more wonderful programs that we're offering. On Saturday, we have a program in partnership with Norway House on Scandinavian immigrants in the Civil War. And there'll be a lot more happening this summer in History Revealed, as well as programs at our historic site, Gibbs Farm. So again, check out our website for that. This program, as you may have noticed, is being recorded. It will be up on our Ramsey County Historical Society YouTube channel, probably in the middle part of next week. So if you miss any of it, or you have friends you want to share it with, please feel free to do so. We would like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. And you can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, it's www.rchs.com. That includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society is pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. We are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we're pleased to bring you tonight's program. To that end, in 2023, we are continuing to bring you programs focused on our series, Making Minnesota, which explores the untold stories, histories, and experience of some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and indigenous communities that make up this, our most diverse county. I want to thank our presenter tonight, and just remind everybody, if you can keep your microphones and cameras turned off during John's presentation, we'd appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe of the Eastside Freedom Library.
Thank you, Robin, and welcome everyone. Are we getting at the? Well, I'll be. Here we go. It's my pleasure to introduce John Andreazzi, someone I've known for a long time. John hails from Lackawanna in upstate New York, near Buffalo. Over the years, he's been a teacher, a clinical social worker, a community organizer, and more recently, an ethnic historian. For more than 50 years, John has been studying the experiences of Italian Americans. And he moved here in the mid-1980s to work for the Immigration History Research Center at the U. And with them, he produced a guide to the records of the Order of the Sons of Italy, and also contributed an essay to a book on Italian immigrants in small towns. We'll find out tonight if the east side of St. Paul should be thought of as a small town, or if that's how our Italian neighbors experienced it. I'm very happy that John is with us this evening, and I think we're all going to learn a great deal from his presentation. So I'm going to turn things over to John Andreazzi.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. I'm glad to be here. If you see me leaning to one side, I'm having a little trouble with some backbones and muscles, so please bear with me. The first thing I want to do is do something Italian Americans often do, and we ask each other, what part of Italy are your people from? Well, my mother was born in Calabria, and she came here as a girl of 10. My father was born in Lackawanna, New York, and his father was born just south of Rome in a town called Falvatera. Grandma Andriozzi was born in a riverside tenement in Buffalo, and her people are from La Basilicata, which is the boot of the arch of the Italian boot. Lastly, I want to say I grew up in the lands that were formerly held by the Seneca Nation, which was part of the Iroquois Confederation. Okay, next slide, please. History is important, and we know I've been a mental health worker in the past. Knowing one's history is very important. What got me started on this 50, 60 years ago was I didn't realize how much our Italian background influenced my parents. And they would sort of like keep it a secret almost. So I tried to learn the secret, what was going on. And that's how I got into it. And it is important, I think, for all of us to know our histories, both individually and how we fit into big nationwide and worldwide events, such as mass migration to America and so forth. This is all crucial to me, and I hope some of you will follow up on your own at the group, no matter what it be. All these stories are part of America, and part of writing history is to make sure they're included. Next slide, please. In Minnesota, as you might guess, Italians didn't flock to in great numbers because of the distance mostly. But a lot of Italians came here after stopping somewhere else. One of the big stopping off places was Cumberland or Chicago, and then Cumberland, where railroad crews were dispatched to work throughout the Midwest. And other people have come here from just about every state you can mention in the Union and from other countries. Next slide, please. In Italy, I know there's a map here that's got a lot of confusing data, but most of the Italians in the United States, 80 to 85% of them, come from southern Italy. If you look in the middle of the peninsula at that large blue area on the left side, that's where Rome is located. Anything south of Rome is considered southern Italy, and most Italians in the United States have their roots there. In our case, in Minnesota, we have a great deal of immigrants from Abruzzo, which you see across from Rome, on halfway down the page on the right side, and from Calabria, which is the toe of the boot, and halfway in between them, the brown-colored one that says Campania, where Naples is, they've sent a lot of immigrants. Now, immigrants have come from all over, but those three especially are notable in the number of people they've sent to the Minnesota. On the North Iron Range, which you said the largest Italian population, it's different. Many of the Italians there are from the north. And if you look at that map at the top right of the screen, you see Friuli, Venezia, Giulia. A lot of people from there came to the state, and a lot of people from the Piedmont on this other side, the left side, that yellowish color, have come here, and other people from that area in general. Next slide. All right, this is an example of a town in southern Italy, Ripobotani. People from Ripobotani is in the region of Molise, which is just south of Abruzzo. It's halfway up the Italian boot. And people from there in a nearby town of Casa Calenda formed the bulk of the Italians that lived on the upper levee. So talking about little towns, the upper levee was its own little town, mostly Molisani, people from Molise. Next slide, please. So the towns were looking at all over the state, and including western Wisconsin, like Cumberland. We found 453 towns that sent immigrants to Minnesota. Now, most of the towns are in Piedmont or Trentino Alto Adige, which is in the far north. But most of those people are in the far north of Minnesota also, mining and so forth. In the middle are the Calabrese and Abruzzese from the south, and they send people together from over 100 towns. So we have quite a representation. Some of these towns have sent huge numbers of people. Next slide. Next slide. This is a family, Calabrese, including Calagiuri and other Morocco or Masako and other group of people. They settled in Cumberland, but at least some of them, a good healthy number, moved to St. Paul or Minneapolis. So a lot of towns, if you talk to people, they say they're from their hometown was in Cumberland, Wisconsin. Some of them still go there on vacation or have land there that they rent. Let's get back on screen here. Okay, next screen, please. Next. Chain migration. This is what we call chain migration. Next slide, please. When people come, one or two immigrants will come from a town, then right back home say, hey, there's jobs here. I can get you hooked up. And then others follow. And that's what followed, like the people in Cumberland. They wrote back to people in Abruzzo and Molise, and then brought them over here. Some people did a more interesting twist on that. There were some Sicilian immigrants who went up to Canada first. This was a little later when America had restricted immigration laws. And in Canada, they were working at some sort of lodge out in the middle of nowhere. And eventually the lodge couldn't break even. And the employee said, we'll buy it from you. And they did. And they wrote all their paesani, the people from their same towns in Italy, said, come to us. You can live here for a while. Then when you get all your papers together, you can go to America. Now, this is especially true for people from two towns, Termini Merese and Santa Catarina Veramuso. I didn't pronounce that right, but you get the idea. Most of the Sicilian immigrants in this town, in St. Paul, are from those two towns. They're from other towns too, but mostly those two towns. So you have them settling in what is called the Badlands, just west of where Regent's Hospital is, or on North Mount Airy Street, just north of Regent's Hospital. Next, please. Next slide. What kind of work do they do? Well, there you see it, railroad, by and large. Italians worked in the railroads in all states, and they literally built a lot of them. In this state, the largest single number of men who worked were on the railroads, and that includes several people, about 33 of them in 1930, who were on the city trolley car tracks. They would repair those, so another form of railroad work. Another large group were in the food industry, especially fruit and vegetables. The Southern Italians knew how to handle citrus fruits and other fruits, and they would sell these going around in baskets, door to door. And then later, if they did well, they get a horse. And then if they still did well, they get a horse and wagon. And then if they did really good, they get a truck eventually. They also sold bread that way. So many people were in the food business. Okay, next slide, please. The railroad work was very costly. In the United States, between 1890 and 1920, 86,600 railroad workers died on the job. In just 1910, 3,300, almost 3,400 railroad workers were killed in the US and 95,000 injured just in that 1 year. So it was very dangerous work, and that's one of the reasons they wanted immigrants here. You know, many people, for a good reason, did not want to do that kind of work. Okay. Next slide, please. I gave you some information on where they settled in different parts of the Twin Cities. There's a small settlement in Stillwater, mostly from Cuggiano, a town, I think it's up in Lombardy area in far northern Italy. And then in Dilworth, there were railroad workers who went there and settled, and they stood there, but they lived on the wrong side of the tracks, is their problem, literally. And then there's a bunch who went to Duluth, some of them Northern Italians who were good stone workers. Next slide, please. Oh, Sweet Hollow. Okay, next slide. All right, here's a map. I'm sorry we can't get it in greater detail to you, but you could see the Failing Creek winding generally southward. Right alongside of it is Payne Avenue and other streets which make up Railroad Island. And it was a series of, and I never saw it in person. I was born in another state, but there were some very substantial buildings. Some of the Italian immigrants had a lot of admiration for the Swedes who built them because they were great craftsmen. Other things look like shacks that they threw together. And I was told by one family, you wait till someone moved out of the shack, then you moved in. There was no formal anything. You just when there were vacancies. So it was a combination of different types of building that they had. Next slide, please. Here's a look at a home. This is in less than wonderful shape, and that's what happened over time. It's right along Failing Creek. That actually is called North Failing Creek. South Failing Creek, south of 7th Street, was known as Connemara, I think, an Irish name for people from that town. The bishop had arranged for them to live there, and they were benefited from, I don't know if he was an Irish or English Quaker who sent money to these different Irish colonies throughout the world that weren't doing well. And so that's another take that I hadn't heard before on what was going on the east side. Next slide, please. A winter view of the ravine. You're looking north toward the Ham's Brewery, and you can see that some of them look like regular houses. And if you look carefully, you'll see other things that are less like a house, more like a shack. But people lived in there, and most of the people I talked to had glowing memories. Now, most of them didn't live there. They got the memories from Mama, Papa, and so forth. But it was a warm community, as they described. They would sit together on railroad ties and build a fire and sing and have someone playing some song and sing a song in some language, and the rest would chip in as they could with the words and so forth. So what I got from them was a great sense of community, talk about a small village. It was isolated. I don't know what the depth was, 75 feet of the ravine, but they certainly were isolated, although there were stairways that went up on the street, as they said. And one man loved it so much, Tony Sancelli, every Sunday when he came home from work, he would stand on some bridge or prominent place and sing America the Beautiful. So his ticket out of the poverty of Italy and out of the poverty of the Hollow was to eventually get more jobs that paid better and move the family up to the street. Okay, next slide, please. This is a baptism of one of the Russo family, and they were a large family that lived in Sweet Hollow. And the Russos and the DuPonts are the first ones that I could find that lived there. Before it was mostly Swedish and some Poles, and then Italians came in larger numbers. As they came in, um, their numbers grew and grew. They eventually, by the 1915, 1920s, they had dozens and dozens of homes that they occupied, and they were the dominant group in numbers. I didn't hear much about any conflict between people. There was a few crimes committed here and there. The newspapers continually savaged them, saying they're a slum, these people are no good. It's the things we usually say about poor people, minority groups. Same stuff, just a different time, different groups. But they were continually slandered. Next slide, please. Concetta Pareana lived in the Sweet Hollow, and she's shown with her children, if you can see them there, Mary and Albert, 1923. She was the nurse. She wasn't a trained nurse. She knew home remedies, how to set bones and so forth. In every community, I know there was an Italian woman, at least one who could do that. And she maybe also helped deliver babies. So she's one of those very down-to-earth people that is very valued in the community. And I don't think they drew ethnic lines in who she served. It sounded like they all helped each other when they could. Next slide, please. There's looking south toward the 6th Street Bridge. And then down there, farther south, would be the Irish community I mentioned earlier. That was, again, Archbishop
Ireland.
What was the Archbishop's name again?
Ireland.
Ireland. How could I forget that? Yes, the Archbishop personally sent people there with some funds, and then, as I said, other funds came in through donors from across the sea. All right, next slide, please. Here we are in Sweet Hollow. Ferdinand Iacaldo and Dominic Barilla are there. Iacaldo, there's no Y in Italian, but they changed it from IAC to something more friendly to the English language. It was important the way you pronounce your name and even change it, because a lot of Americans, as soon as they saw a last name like that or heard you speaking with an Italian brogue, that was it. You wouldn't be hired or you'd be sent away. But the son of this Ferdinand, he wrote quite a bit about his memory of the Sweet Hollow and up on the street. Next slide, please. Railroad Island. I gave very short shrift to this Sweet Hollow. Sorry to all you Sweet Hollow fans, but there is a lot of good literature. Some of the men I mentioned have written it, and there's a book on it. So I would advise you to see them. I'm just trying to give you an idea that how Italians may have viewed things. Railroad Island, next slide, please. You can see it's definitely a sort of a triangle-shaped thing. Down at the bottom by East 7th Street, you see things converge, and from the railroad tracks surrounded it on all sides, across the top and on the right and the left. So that's why they call it Railroad Island. And that too had its own boundaries, at least a psychological boundary to it. The little black dots, the structures that are colored black, were inhabited by Italians. Now that number eventually grew. By 1910, there was a small amount of people there, but then by 1915 and 1920, it really swelled to a larger number. I'm not sure for the reason for that. I think World War I may have had a reason, something to do with it. But anyhow, the numbers grew up there. Okay, next slide, please. This is looking down Payne Avenue from Minnehaha, I believe, in World War I, 1917, 1918. And it's you can see the Liberty Bonds there. the government not only expected, it just about demanded that you show up for patriotic events, even if your country was on the right side. Like for Italians, the Italy was on the right side. The Italians fought with and for the British and the French and Americans. But even there, if you were foreign, they wanted you to be 100% American, not just some of it, but completely American. And again, they expect you to buy bonds, turn out for the freedom parades, the war bond parades, and so forth. And Italians here were under pressure to do that. And there was citizens, I can't remember the group, but they were sort of like vigilantes. They could go into your house and say, what do you got in there? You carry a gun. What's this? What's that? So that was very intrusive and very scary for the immigrants, especially the ones whose former nation was at war with the United States. Next slide, please. This is the Crispus Attucks home. About the only Black people that lived in Rhode Island lived in this home. It was a home for elderly and I think often also for orphans. Now, a lot of the guys my age said as kids, they would go to one of the stores around there and talk to the old timers, and they enjoyed it. Apparently, it was a friendly gathering place. So I think that's a good introduction to race relations for some of them. But that was about, I think, the only people of color you might see there. In Swede Hollow, the Mexicans replaced the Italians, but I'm not sure there were many Mexicans living up in I get my memory loss here sometime, in Rhode Island. Next slide, please. This is the Brunson home, which I think is still there. I'm not sure. It's a historic landmark. It's the first brick building, I think, in the state, or certainly in the city. And so that was a landmark that the Italians lived along, having that in sight. And certainly that gives you a much different feeling than some of the sites in the hollow. Okay, next slide. This is Frank and Francis Russo's grocery store on Collins Street. It is now called Tedesco Street, and they had quite a business there. And the government decided at one time they were going to put a highway through there. So they tore down a lot of these buildings along there, and then they changed their mind. They weren't going to put a highway through there. And so there were some new homes put up. And one of my friends who grew up in that area and still is living there, probably one of the last Italians in that neighborhood. This is one of many businesses there. Next slide, please. This is Joe Russo's barber shop. He was there for many years. And it was one of the landmarks of the businesses there, among many. Okay. Next slide, please. This is the corner bar at the corner of Payne Avenue, 565 Payne Avenue. And there were a lot of places like that. At least in these pictures, these folks seem like, and I know people pose pictures, at least they all seem neighborly and like they're enjoying themselves. There was a sense of a small town there. And many people who I've talked to about these towns agree, as I try and straighten myself up here. Okay, next slide. This is a famous picture of, it's from the earthen ovens on Hopkins Street. And she's a Deloya and he's a Cucurella. I can't think of their first names. But those are massive loaves of bread. And one or two people, at least, maybe more, owned these furnaces. They were like igloos. And they were often made by pile a mound of dirt and then pouring cement 6 to 8 inches thick on top of it with one opening. And then you could heat rocks up, put them in there, and it could cook for hours. And so people were taking the bread, they get an assigned hour, they cook the bread, and away they went with loaves of bread like that. I've had home cooked bread, but that really looks tasty. Next slide, please. This is the Carletta grocery. Don Carletta, with a couple of his customers. That was there for quite a while, and it was a popular gathering spot. Many people mentioned that as something important in the neighborhood, and they would shop there when they could. Next slide, please. These are some of the, looks like ladies at the Christ Child Center. No, they're at their house on Jesse Street, and they're preparing Christmas food to be eaten. The lady on the left is Jenny Barilla Mechtel. Okay, next slide, please. Reception. Approximately 5.5 to 6 million Italians landed in the U.S. in the last 100 or more years, since 1820. And they had a mixed reception. By the way, the largest group of immigrants who entered legally were Germans, 6.8 million. The next largest was Mexicans, 6.3 million or so. These are all legal entries. And the Italians are next with anywhere from 5.5 to 6 million people. Now, if you think that the Mexicans have a habit of coming over illegally, I know Italians who came over in midnight boats across Lake Erie. So it wasn't just one ethnic group that crossed the line to get in, especially when there was restrictive immigration laws. All right, so America's reception was, we want you here for your work, but we don't want you here as neighbors. We don't like you, but we want you to work here. That's my interpretation of what American society was saying in general to Italians and to many other groups, especially ones from Southern and Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. This is the title of the book, a WAP, which is a pejorative name for Italians. This book shows all these cartoons. You can see little mafia figures with knives in their mouths swimming ashore while Uncle Sam turns his head away or doesn't know what to do with him. So there was a lot of this type of thing, this type of literature, movies. There's one movie made in about 1915, just called The Italian. And they made him an almost murderer, but he changed his mind at the last minute. So Italians have this unenviable spot of being criminal and bad. Next slide, please. Prejudice and discrimination. Italians is a problem. Next slide, please. Here's a organ grinder. And you see the man walking, holding his ears. A lot of people wrote to the newspapers here in St. Paul and Minneapolis. These guys are making too much noise. They make us sick. Can't we get them off the streets? Enough the cops did usher them away. But this was a way of making some money. Sometimes they would have monkeys with them, or we give people a card or read their fortune or whatever. But this was the image a lot of people have of Italians, of a man like that on a sidewalk. Let's get to the next slide, please. Assimilation stages. Next slide, please. This is the Lincoln School, better known to some of my buddies as the Lincoln Academy, to make it sound like it was more than it was. But that was right in Railroad Island, right on Collins Street or Tedesco Street. And people spoke warmly of it because it was mostly all Italian and they knew everyone. And so that made for a good small town atmosphere. And they had different programs for the kids, which they were appreciated at that time. Next slide, please. This is Joe Palumbo. He was a son of an immigrant. His son was Dick Palumbo. He was a music teacher. His father, Joe, did well as a second generation man. The immigrant is the first generation, the second generation is the American born. He did well for himself. You can see him he's going to high school in the uniform of Creighton High School. And he's from the town of Fragneto Labate in Campania near Naples. A huge number of people from that town came to settle here, and including on the east side in Railroad Island. Next slide, please. These are some of the people graduating. I can't make the writing up, but they're graduating from a class at Lincoln Academy. And the people spoke with pride about doing that. A lot of people didn't even get out of 8th grade. They went to work or just didn't want to deal with school anymore. So to graduate from 8th grade is great. And to go to high school was really a big deal. But most of the families couldn't afford that. They wanted those kids to do work. Okay, next slide, please. Acculturation. Acculturation means learning the new culture, learning the ways of a culture. In America, it meant you learn our culture and what wasn't said, but it was meant, and you forget your old culture. So you quit talking Italian, you quit acting foreign, dressing foreign, you act American, you'll be all right. You do anything that's too foreign or too radical, you're going to have troubles. So the acculturation was taught sometimes in gentle ways, sometimes in very harsh ways. The settlement houses often were the more gentle way. Next slide, please. This is the Christ Child Center in Railroad Island. At one time, it burned down, and then the Italia Club rebuilt the building and had their headquarters in there, and the rest was used by the center. They had a network around the nation of women who were very involved with their churches who contributed to this. So there was some help in these centers. Of course, they were teaching them things that cast doubts on their foreign culture. They might have done it gently, or they may have done it more severely. But most of the kids were very fond of that place because they had every kind of program you can think of, even a rifle range in the basement during World War II. So that was the Christ Child Center. And there was a saying, "I'll meet you at the Christ Child," meaning I'll meet you there at that center. Now they have dances there, and naturally people from farther away, like from north of Minnehaha and Farquhar Street, I hope I pronounced that right. They came down, and some of the more macho Italian gentlemen would be there at the bridge where they came over the bridge, and they would say, "We don't like you. You can't go there. The rest of you be real nice to the Italian girls, or else." And it's good that they wanted to protect the Italian girls, but that wasn't, I would say, the correct way to do it. And some of the Italian girls said, yeah, they should have took the lesson to art themselves. But that was part of the system then. Your neighborhood, you protected. All groups, I think, did that. Next slide. A winter carnival for the Christ Child Center. And here are some of the contestants, all Italian American girls. Next slide, please. This is a group. I'm not sure exactly what they're doing, but some group activity at the Christ Child Center in 1934. They had a lot of programs for adults, especially the women, mothers clubs and whatever. The men were a little harder to get involved, but maybe they might come for English classes or citizenship classes. Next slide. These guys, I get a kick out of looking at them. They remind me of the guys in my neighborhood, a little rough around the edges, but they're a basketball team. And I assume the guys in the suits are their coaches, but they were representing the Christ Child Center in the early 30s, from 30 to 32. Okay, next slide, please. This is a women's group at the Christ Child Center. And again, there are several types of group, including groups just to sit and chat or discuss this or discuss that. But it didn't lack for groups. I've seen the list of groups. They had some for every age range of girls this age, boys this age, adults, and so forth, and activities. Next picture, please. This is, I think, a graduation or a play, courtesy of Jenny Barilla McDowell, who often was involved in these things from 1948. It's a children's choir that's singing there. Next slide, please. Building an ethnic community and identity. America allowed its immigrants, at least the white ones, to have their own neighborhood as long as they played by the rules and they were working on getting out of there and becoming good Americans and living in the suburbs or whatever. So the Italians had to build an ethnic community. Don't forget they were from all parts of Italy. They couldn't understand each other half the time. I know immigrants who got on the boat in Naples. The boat was full of Italians, and they couldn't understand half of them, what they were saying, because the dialects were that different. So one of the language problems they had was just talking to each other. So they'd often use words from each other's dialect, or they'd make up words like the outhouse or back house would be backhouse, or a shovel for shovel, or cara for car, and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of words like that, and go on and on and on, that they would use. They would Italianize English words, and that got them through. Okay, next slide, please. Here's another women's group meeting, and women and men, and I don't know what the event is. But it's another social type event that will show the importance of this center for the community. Next slide, please. Religious institutions. Next slide. Bishop Ireland. The Italians were considered a problem. The Catholic Church called it the Italian problem. Why? What was the Italian problem? Well, Italians, the highest worship they could do is on the day of their patron saint, is march around with a pagan statue and pin money on it. This drove the Irish crazy, and they tried to ban that as much as they could. He tried to keep them in line by keeping them at what that time was the cathedral. It was on St. Peter's Street, and he kept them downstairs. And so they fixed up the downstairs, but he wouldn't let them have their own building for a while. He was trying to make sure they were getting the right thoughts. But they still celebrated up to 12 saints a year with a procession or some sort of ceremony. So the Irish were the ones who formed the Knights of Columbus as their way of offsetting the bad reputation of the Molly Maguires. And they chose the name Columbus because they liked Columbus because he was the first Catholic hero in America. Next slide, please. Father Louis Pioletti, a veteran of the Army in World War I, I believe, the Italian Army. He arrived here in the city in 1924, and immediately he was appointed pastor of Holy Redeemer Church, a church which was finally built in 1911 over on College Street, I think it was, near where the current Minnesota History Center is located. That's where it was. And the I-94 took care of that church. In the 65, they leveled it. But he was a pastor there and then later at Saint Ambrose. Next slide. This is Italian altar boy carrying the candle at the center left, Holy Redeemer. It's for some religious ceremony for Father Pioletti. And Petruton wasn't his name. It was Pietro Antonio, I think. They shortened it a little bit. That was very typical. A lot of Italians did that. Just saying your name a funny way could get you dirty looks or worse at that time. Next slide, please. The Church of the Holy Redeemer. That's taken 9 years after it was formed. And that's the one that the freeway took away in the mid-60s. Next slide, please. That's a parade of first communicants in 1925. And that's from Saint Ambrose. Saint Ambrose was a saint born in Germany. And it was said that when he was born, bees landed on his head and they laid honey there, but they didn't sting him. So he is the patron saint of beekeepers and a couple other specialties, and he's the patron saint of Milan in Italy. So it's not a common name on churches. So someone asked me a question, I looked it up. That's what I found out about the name Saint Ambrose. Next slide, please. This is the St. Anthony Society. It was founded in 1904. This is around 1920, early 20s. And there they are in front of, that must be Holy Redeemer Church. And it was a large group. I think they still occasionally meet, but now it's very elderly. And I know they didn't want anyone to come and speak when I asked them. They politely declined my offer. So I still might be going because they would go to mass and then have breakfast afterwards at the Polish church off West 7th Street. I think it's St. Stan's, I'm not sure. So that was one of the first Italian groups organized. Next slide, please. This is at the new St. Ambrose Church. St. Ambrose Church, the original one taken over was from the German Methodist congregation right at 7th Street and Payne Avenue. But then that fell into disrepair, so they built a new one in the 50s, and this is there. And then later on, I don't know, 30 years later, they decided to move the parish out to Woodbury. Well, none of the Italians went, so people in Woodbury, I imagine, are using that church now. Next slide. This is looks like a confirmation group. Yes, confirmation class in the 1950s. Everyone dressed in white, boys and girls, with the nuns in the background. Next slide, please. This is a fair for a religious procession afterwards. And these guys are taking care of the beverages that are offered them. And this is another thing that drove the Irish nuts. The Italians would have these festivals, and they spend a lot of money on them with food and drink, and then fireworks. And I heard a priest telling the Italians in charge of the event, saying, "Why don't you give that money to church? We can hardly heat the church, and you're shooting off fireworks." And they said, "Well, Father, that's the way it is." Italians, the men, part of the problem the Irish had with them, the Italian men were very anti-clerical. Not all of them, there were certainly devout ones. But in general, they, like my two grandfathers, didn't break a leg getting to church. And often they were less than cordial in church. They didn't like some of the things being demanded, like more money, collections, whatever. Some churches in Italy, they had benefactors, so they never paid any kind of dues. So they were very unused to that. And I hope I'm not driving you guys crazy looking like I'm standing on my head. But they, so when they came here and the priest asked for money, and they said, "What's he talking about?" And they learned the hard way that That's expected. The priest in Lackawanna told me he knew some of the guys working in the steel plant made a good dollar. He said they were very stingy. They didn't give a lot. And that was part of it. Others were very generous. Next slide, please. This is when I talked about a new Saint Ambrose church being built. This is the dedication of the cornerstone of that. It was in the mid 50s, I think 54, 57, that this happened. And you see all the people crowded around for this event. And these are often big events, and they produced bulletin booklets and so forth for the Italians. I think a lot of other groups. Often they're very good sources of history, those type of books. But this would keep the church in Railroad Island, a little bit farther north than it was. This would be on Burr Street. Okay, next slide, please. This I couldn't find the label for. I think it was a priest who was having religious instruction with these young gentlemen. I would guess that might be outside Christ Community Center, but I'm not sure. But that's what I think that's all about. Next, please. Building an ethnic community. Organizations. Next slide. This is the UNICO chapter. UNICO is a national organization, and people here joined it in 1940, give or take a year. And one of them, the Divinity men, Ralph, I think they call himself Divine. He became a national president. But they did a lot of charitable work, gave scholarships. It's now a very small group. The old timers are mostly all gone, but it still has a function, and it did a lot of public and patriotic things, writing hometowns in Italy, advising them in 1948 not to vote for the communists, but to vote for the Christian Democrat, as was the American foreign policy, and so forth. They received millions of letters from people, not only here, but around the country. Next slide, please. This is an Italian dance group for the Festival of Nations. Look at the size of that group. These are all Italian girls, and they would do dancing and so forth. I think they also had a group that was co-ed, and they did dances too. But this gives you an idea of the ways they can keep their ethnic identity, but within a respectable American domain. The organization for, and I'm forgetting the name of it, whatever. Next, please. These are some folks at another event. And again, it's a social event. And I think it might involve dancing and singing by some of the outfits the ladies are wearing. Next slide, please. So what these people are doing here, the women's dance group is dancing with some men partners in the streets. So the old timers who couldn't get to these halls downtown, so they could watch and see some of the old Italian dances done. And again, this was being ethnic, but within a framework of being American. America said, you can act ethnic if you're nice, but get back to the American part. So you didn't want to be too ethnic. And I've watched people of my parents' generation do this, be very ethnic within their home, but when they went out, they would have a whole different era about them to be respectable. Next, please. Other institutions. Next slide, please. Well, one thing to do would be patriotic and to help the former homeland is in World War I to send money or ambulances to Italy. They had terrible casualties in Northeast Italy fighting in World War I. And so these ambulances were a really well-deserved gift. And the Italians of St. Paul raise the money to get that to the Italian forces. If you're familiar with the book by Hemingway, one of his novels includes him being an ambulance driver. Okay, next slide, please. One hero we got to mention is Columbus. By the late 20s, there was an Italian federation throughout the state. They formed about 20 branches in different locales, mostly up in the range. For each city, you had a branch of the Columbus Memorial Association. What was their job? To raise money, nickels, dimes, pennies, for Columbus, for the statue. And within 4 years, they had the statue up. It was done by a man named Brioschi in town, who was a sculptor. And they put the statue up. And the Italians, I think, were very clever in choosing Columbus because they looked in the textbooks, if they could read, or if they were told, and they said, among the American heroes, there's no Italians except this guy named Columbus, who supposedly discovered America. So they took that, and the Irish liked it too because he was Catholic. And together, the Irish and the Italians, one of the few times they worked together, they got 43 states to pass some sort of legislation honoring, there has to be some sort of ceremony honoring Columbus Day. Now, some states have now recanted that and so forth. I'm not going to get into a whole debate about Columbus, but it's a good debate to have. That's not why I'm here today. But as you know, the Columbus statue was torn down, and the state is deciding what to do with him. Next. American institutions, businesses. Next. Well, one professional thing is the police. Frank Branca was an 1890 policeman. He maybe was a second or third to be a policeman. I don't have a picture of the early two. The first one was Charles Deloso, and he found it was a mixed blessing. He was the pride of the Italian community. He was elected president of the first Italian group in the state, the Dante Alighieri Club, formed in 1883 here in St. Paul, and so forth. Well, in 1891, a man was murdered by another Italian murdered another man. And the Deloso did his job, and he said, this is the man. And the Italian community said, what do you mean? He's one of ours. If you testify him in court, you testify against him, you might get him in real deep doo-doo. And he was even threatened, but no one actually followed through on the threats. But this is where your ethnicity becomes, we're glad you're a cop. We need more people represented, but you got to stick up for our boys too. But he said, no, I'm paid to enforce the law. Thank you. So next one, please. Next slide. First Italian fireman, Anthony Segale. He was from the far north of Italy. And in 1909, he became the first Italian firefighter here in St. Paul. I don't know much more about than that. These guys would all have interesting stories. I'd like to see people write about them some more. Okay, next slide, please. Vic Tedesco, who was they renamed Collins Street in his honor. He was on the city council. He was a very colorful character, and he did some good things in his term. And he wrote a book. It was a takeoff on, there was a movie or play called I Never Sang for My Father. He wrote a book, I Always Sang for My Father. He was a musician, he had a band, and he took his band to play at the high and mighty people's balls and dances and whatever. So he was quite a figure in town. Next slide. Fitting into America, institutions. Sports and entertainment. I didn't have any sports or entertainment things handy, but that's one of the ways you get in is entertainment. The National Football League is over 75% Black. And I don't think it's because like it's a superior athletes. I mean, they're good athletes, but it's one of the avenues open to them. 120 years ago, I saw an article say the Irish are natural athletes. Well, that's their natural athletes because they were often discriminated against, and they had to use that vehicle to get money and prestige and so forth. So, what was taught at the Christ Child Center and other places was not bocce, but volleyball and football and so forth. So that was another way of getting the Italians to Americanize. Next slide, please. Personal relationships. The ultimate in assimilation is to marry outside your ethnic group and or have friendships outside your ethnic group. But intermarriage is the way. And if you look at the second generation, that's the children of the immigrants, many of them married outside the group. Other Catholics, usually Irish or Poles, and sometimes Swedes too, when they get along. So that was a very important part of like those dances they had at the Christ Child Center and so forth. That was a very important function. Next slide, please. Here are some young guys. I don't have their names. They're standing near Hopkins and Bradley. They're sort of the belle figure, cutting a good image of themselves. Those guys look like they're dressed up for something very important. They're just standing outside talking. And that was part of the community. You stood around and you talked. They might take a passeggiata, a walk around the block, that type of thing. Next. Here we see bocce players. In the middle, standing with the undershirt on, is Father Pioletti, a man of the people. Now, he would play bocce with these guys, and he probably enjoyed it very much. And I think that's one of the things that made him popular. He was strict, and he knew how to grab ears of little boys who got lippy or obnoxious. But he was also loved, too, they say. Next slide, please. Become an American, the second generation. Next slide, please. This is Elizabeth Barilla on Payne Avenue with her child. In the background is the old Saint Ambrose Church. And you would see a lot of this people outside. Italians use space differently. The outside, the sidewalks, driveways are used for being social, being seen, whatever. Other groups wouldn't do that. So it's a difference in that community. Next slide. This is the Frascone family, Michelina and Russell Frascone with their daughters. They were very instrumental. They're in their dance outfits for their dance group. They were very instrumental in keeping that group going for a long time. And their family is featured in that, I can't think of the name of the display at the Historical Society that shows the inside of a house with 3 or 4 generations of people living there, including Italians. I think that then monk came and so forth. And you lift up the plate and you hear them speaking. Next slide, please. Prejudice and discrimination, minority group. Next slide. Defining Italian American, work and business since 1940. Well, things have changed a lot since 1940. World War II was a huge turning point. Italians fought in the armed services in large numbers and died in large numbers too. And they proved if anyone was thinking they weren't so patriotic that they would join. When we were fighting Mussolini, we fought him. He was an enemy until the summer of 1943 when he surrendered. Then the Germans came in and they took over a lot of Italy. But redefining Italian American meant being a good patriotic people who helped the war effort and sent their boys to die in the war. Next slide, please. Reconnecting with the old country. Well, a lot of guys like me went back to the old country to meet relatives. And that's a popular thing now. People are applying for dual citizenship and so forth on reading up about Italy, and that's good. So I'm glad to see that. I was glad to meet some of my relatives there. They were very kind and gracious to us. Next, please. This is the Frescone family, and that man, his first name was Odilio. I can't think of his last name. He was always around with that instrument, playing that at any kind of a function. He was very good at it. And he was one of the fixtures in Italian-American culture in St. Paul. Next slide, please. Tony Bellata has the winemaking equipment in here he inherited from Grandpa. And there you see it, the press, the hat, and the boots. A lot of Italian men would get a barrel and wash and step with boots in it, and that's the way they crush the grapes. Next slide, if there is one. All right. In Minnesota, according to the 2010 census, the German people of German extraction who claimed that were almost 2 million. If you combine the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Danes, who are all
Scandinavian.
Scandinavian, thank you. They're 1.4 million, and then they're Irish, and then Italian come in at the number 8 situation. So Italians here are a small group, relatively, but I think one that is well known. Next slide, please. We did Festa Italiana, a bunch of us, and that's it down at the Lake Harriet Island. And there's the dancers, I ballerini, Italian dancers. And it was a beautiful setting on them on the river there. Next slide, please. I couldn't resist. My wife said, "You got to show this." So, Linda, I'm showing this, and I hope you guys get a laugh out of it. This is a young man doing what young men do sometimes. I think that's the last slide, or am I wrong? One more? That's it. Okay.
Wait, Robin wanted to take down. Yep, great. So John, I have a question. Sophie Hall wants to know, what about the upper levy?
The
Upper levy.
upper levy. Well, that's a whole other community, and it deserves to be studied. And they really saw them. A lady named Sickles, a sociologist in the 30s and 40s, she wrote about them. She said, this is the most isolated ethnic area in the city. So that was mostly people from Molise, and Cassetta and Mancini's have some roots there, and they have a little statue in honor of them that's overlooking that area, which is now covered with luxury apartments.
Brad Griffith wants to know, what about neighborhood newspapers?
What about neighborhood
Neighborhood newspapers.
papers? I know Italian boys would sell papers. They sell them. Joe Russo said he would sell papers for 3 cents and he could keep 1 cent of it. And that was big money back then when he was a kid. There was an Italian newspaper put out by Palumbo and another man, his brother-in-law. It didn't last long. It was in the mid-20s. That's the only one I know of. But they would get the nationwide ones like Il Progresso and others.
Thank you. And what about the Italians in Northeast Minneapolis?
What about?
The Italian community there.
They had this basically the same mix. They're more heavily Calabrese, but they have a lot of people from Cumberland, a lot of Abruzzese. Their neighborhood too, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church, is now mostly non-Italian, but Italians still go there. They have a very successful men's group that used to be part of Unico, and they made their money through pool tabs and that type of thing. They join other organizations. They give away hundreds of scholarships every year, and they have a big deal on in October on Columbus Day. They had a women's group too, but that had I don't know if that's still going. There's another group in Minneapolis. It's the Italian Cultural Club. Those are people who came over more after World War II and more as professionals, and had quite a different history, which is well worth looking into. I hope we could do something. So they learn about the Italians who preceded them, and then those of us who are the grandchildren of the early Italians, we could look at their history and culture.
How long has the Italian language persisted?
One study in Bridgeport, Connecticut, by the third generation, that is by the grandchild of the immigrant, 14% knew Italian. And our family, my parents, both fluent in Italian, and they wouldn't teach it. Deliberately, they thought they were protecting us.
Are there other questions?
Could we see that slide again?
The what?
Someone wants to see this slide.
Oh, about the ethnic groups?
Yeah.
This is a one-fifth sample of the people who are visited by the census taker. They are asked to fill out a questionnaire saying, what do you consider something like, what do you consider your ethnic background to be? Now, many of these people are not one, they might have 3 or 4 different people in their back. My wife, I think, has 5 different ethnic groups in her history. In my generation, about half of us were 100% Italian, and the other ones mixed. So, and here are the people who are mixed, and notice they're all European and white, which I think is one of them. So the melting pot has worked in some ways. Unfortunately, destroyed a lot of the cultures when I think they could have been kept. And you still insist they learn English and to take part in American culture, but let them have their own culture, their ancient culture too. I don't know if that answers your question.
Robin, let me pass the ball to you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you everybody for thank you for
Oh, Don Garofalo.
yeah. Sophie had a question about wanting to find more information on the people of the levee.
A guy I know is writing a book about it. I don't know where he is with it, but there are things that are, the lady I talked about, the social worker who said it was the most isolated group, her last name is Sickles, and she wrote a book, Around the World in St. Paul or something like that.
Paul.
Yeah. And she also wrote a thesis that's good. And there's some other sources too that don't come to mind. There's a book called Italian Voices, written by a lady who's Mancina Batinich is her married and single name, hyphenated. And she's deceased now, but she wrote a lovely book, all based on interviews with 100 Italian Americans throughout the state. And so those will give you, I got a lot of good information from that. Those will give you a flavor of it. The other place to go is people you know who maybe grew up in Little Italy or near one. They don't have to be Italian, by the way. Sometimes people who live near your ethnic group, they know a lot about the ethnic group. So I would do that. And Other than that, I don't know if you could, if I could get more information from you, I could give you more fine detail. But is there a way people can contact me, or you can?
Sure. They can reach out to the East Side Freedom Library and we'll put them in touch.
Okay. Because off the top of my head, it's hard to remember all these.
Yes.
Well, thank you, John. This was a wonderful presentation. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Watch for more History Revealed. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter to just wrap up quickly.
I just want to thank John and everyone who's joined us and continue to meet us monthly for History Revealed. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll hope to see you soon. And watch for the recording on our YouTube channel, as well as on the Eastside Freedom Library's YouTube channel. So again, thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for being here.